Thank you, Rory. You saved me having to introduce myself. I would say maybe my most relevant expertise here among you all who are all way smarter than me and have way more expertise in AI and neuroscience and so forth is as a teacher, right? I educate human beings, right? Instead of artificial intelligence, right? And so I wanted to start by asking, you guys are a bunch of intellectuals. You had teachers, you had professors. If I ask you, what did a teacher do, like to your brain, to you, when they were effective, what would you say? What would you say it was?
I think it's sparked my curiosity.
Yeah, beautiful. Okay, exactly. The kind of answer I'm looking for, maybe with a title like this, you can tell that's what I'm looking for, right? A lot of times, I've talked in front of other groups of scientists and so forth, and a lot of times they say things related to information and, new paradigms and so forth. But, my perspective as someone who teaches, I teach 8-year-olds, I teach 10-year-olds, I teach 18-year-olds headed to college. My perspective as someone who teaches a wide range of ages of human being is that you are dead in the water if you have not made someone care about something that they didn't care about before, right? I think the most obvious thing about that is that it's a non-cognitive change, right? It's an emotional change that you have, made happen inside of a person's brain. So I think that's my way of introducing what I have to talk about today. Another way of putting it maybe is you make someone see differently than they saw before. See salience where they did not see salience before, right? What is salience? I think that is one way of putting what I think is a major problem for AI. Okay, what are my images up here? On the right here, this is an AI-generated image. You guys know the story of Daedalus and Icarus, of course, right? Right? They designed wings so they could fly. Icarus flew too close to the sun and fell into the ocean. So I typed in, Icarus as computer programmer flying too close to the sun, right? Symbolic, it's not that I think AI researchers are gonna plunge into the ocean, but it is that I think we have fake wings and we keep pretending like they're real wings, right? My favorite phrase for artificial intelligence is fake intelligence, right? Because it's not motivated. My experience with human beings is that all intelligence is motivated and driven essentially by emotion, right? Curiosity. This is a tribute to Mike Levin. Some of you might know who Mike Levin is. I'm very influenced and motivated by his research. He's advised me and a group of people giving talks about what he calls basal cognition, right? The idea that if we want to understand intelligence, we need to start with like the rudimentary basics in extremely primitive organisms and scale up. Right? He often says cognition all the way down. And one of his major points there is that what evolves first is aversion and attraction, right? It's not like analytical, logical reasoning. So again, it sort of speaks to this idea. What's in the middle? This is a neuron, calcium imaging. What's cool about this neuron is that it's taken from a human being, a living human being, with bipolar disorder. And the way it was produced is using this technology called induced pluripotent stem cells. Some of you may have heard of it. Reprogrammed stem cells, they call them sometimes. Yamanaka won a Nobel Prize for this discovery years ago, right? And what it basically allows you to do is take a somatic cell, rewind it into the embryonic stage, and then direct it to become whatever cell type you want, including a neuron. So you can observe in a dish what makes, for example, the neuron of a person with a hereditary psychiatric disease like bipolar different, even at the cellular level, right? And we'll find out, some of that soon. How does this work? Oh, sorry. Oh. Did I disappear? Or should I just be able to click? Oh, beautiful. Yeah, it's working now. Okay, beautiful. All right. So my starting point, my inspiration in the beginning is William James. A theme you're going to see a lot in this is that I think a lot of people in the 19th century had very ahead of their times ideas that haven't really been followed up on because of sort of subsequent developments in neuroscience and cognitive science. And they, of course, didn't have the tools to investigate it. But William James, right? William James has this idea in Varieties of Religious Experience, which is one of my favorite books. I recommend it to everybody. He says insane conditions have this advantage that they isolate special factors of the mental life. They play the part in mental anatomy which the scalpel and the microscope play in the anatomy of the body. To understand a thing rightly, we need to have acquaintance with the whole range of its variations, This is something that in particular in the world of neuropsychiatry, we're not usually focusing on. Again, another person I think had brilliant ideas way before his time, wasn't even a scientist, is Nietzsche. Nietzsche had this notion that the only seeing we have is seeing with perspective. In other words, the only seeing we have is seeing with value, with valence, right? I show all these different organisms here to indicate, well, obviously the star-nosed mole with 22 fingers on his face has a completely different sensorium and a completely different way of representing the world than Kanye West. Maybe Kanye West can represent the world that way. I don't know. The Hydra as well, right? But the other point I want to make is that our ways of seeing, our perspectives aren't stable either, right? They shift continuously. And I think it's important for us to find a way to represent that. And well, you can probably see where I'm headed here. And where do we need to find like the circuitry for producing these perspectives? We need to find it in these really basic proteins in the membranes of neurons, because if there is a stream of consciousness, as William James called it, it's a stream of ions flowing in and out of neurons, right? And of course, we abstract away from that a lot in all of computer science. But what Vincent Marchesi, I'll mention him later, and a number of other people have wanted to argue, certainly Mike Levin wants to argue, is that we need to understand intelligence and cognition at the level of proteins in neurons. These basic, you all are all familiar with this. Some of these are ion channels, the sodium-potassium pump that establishes the gradient across the membrane that allows the action potential to happen. And then you may or may not have heard of these inside proteins, which are called scaffolding proteins or cytoskeletal proteins. What they do is to anchor the membrane proteins in the membrane where they're supposed to be. And if they're not working right, you're not going to think right. Okay, what does everyone think all of these people have in common? They are creative, certainly. So I guess they do all have that in common. Anything else? Yeah.
They all killed themselves, or
Five of them died by suicide. Yeah. Virginia Woolf, Robin Williams, Cobain, Van Gogh. I skipped somebody. Oh, Hemingway. And some like up here, Jimi Hendrix, author of the song Hint, Manic Depression, also died in ways that involve substances. Amy Winehouse, right? Every one of these people either had manic depression, bipolar disorder, or sort of is hypothesized. So we don't know about other ones. Teddy Roosevelt didn't. The reason I put him up here is because both his mother and his brother did. And his brother's daughter was Eleanor Roosevelt, far and away the most influential woman in the United States political history. Okay, maybe Hillary Clinton beats her, but prolific, right? Productive, and sharing many of the same traits as the people up here who had this disorder, right? Okay, so this box, you guys are used to thinking in this way. This box contains everything you can think or feel. This is the closest we're going to get to sort of the kind of graphs you guys have been showing. Right. The way I think about this is that if you think about visualizing individuals along the full range of their variation, as William James said, right? And here I put some axes labels on here. These are inspired by these are inspired by Alan Hobson, who's a sleep researcher. He studied REM sleep and dreaming. I used to work in a lab that studied sleep and dreaming in Kyoto, Japan. And I just remembered I just added these labels when Hidenori was giving his talk, because something about seeing him talk up here, your ideas, coupled with the fact you happen to be Japanese, made me realize, oh yeah, where did I get this idea? I got it from Alan Hobson. Okay, so, and what is this idea? So the idea is that you want to describe a state space, right? And one way to describe it, he was describing a state space of dreaming. is to think in terms of like arousal, like how intensely activated is the brain? How are you directed inward or outward? And then on the other hand, what's the valence? Emotional valence is negative or positive. So up here, this is like a highly motivated, driven person. The red ones maybe are even full on manic, right? Mania is usually not productive because it becomes really scattered. If you don't know anything else about bipolar, if you've ever known anyone who was bipolar, you probably realize they don't sleep like normal people, right? So being highly manic is usually a state where a person's like not sleeping at all and very uncontrolled. So these orange dots are more like Eleanor Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's, niece, right? Or Teddy Roosevelt himself, right? The characters who are in a state of goal-directed drive and a positive affect, focused outward, right? But not in a way that's pathological, and yet they are just, in close proximity in some state space to people who we would diagnose with illness. Another way of thinking about this is that this is just the state space of an individual, right? And each one of us has some kind of probability distribution as to where we're likely to be in that space. I know you just heard me talk for a few minutes, but I'm someplace up here, definitely, right? Most of the time. And other people will have a different, distribution. Okay, but obviously that's not how we think of mental illness right now. We classify the healthies and the crazies, healthies and sick. That's pretty much all we can do. And we think of disease as something to be cured. If you have ever known someone with autism or bipolar disorder, you ought to realize what they have is not curable, right? It's a personality, right? Yes, it needs treatment, but the idea that it's a disease in need of cure is doesn't even make sense. So I put these up because the one on the right is a wonderful book, The Anatomy of Melancholy by Robert Burton, written in the time of Shakespeare. I recommend it to everybody. 1621, pretty much in a sense, we haven't really changed the way we classify mental illness from that time. He included lycanthropy, which is werewolves, right? So we took werewolves out of this edition, but other than that, we're still classifying people, and we're not characterizing continuous variation. Another key theme, I first heard a psychiatrist from McLean at Harvard talk about this 10 years ago. And he was talking about it. As you can tell, I've been gathering information about bipolar disorder for a long time. He was talking about bipolar disorder, and he said we shouldn't think of it as a mood disorder. It isn't. That's sort of a downstream consequence. What it really is an energy disorder. So I was thrilled when I saw this book came out a year or two ago. It's by another McLean psychiatrist, and it basically surveys this huge body of research suggesting his thesis, his sort of admittedly radical thesis, that all mental illnesses are fundamentally metabolic disorders, and that they have to do with dysfunction in mitochondria that changes glucose metabolism in some way, right? That makes basically the availability of energy to neurons fluctuate in ways that are, suboptimal or variant, right? And down here, of course, this is just another illustration of how mitochondria are manufactured down here, I guess, and shuttled out to the axon. So there's a lot of different things that could break, that could make something to do with, glucose metabolism get screwed up and cause you to think different. And again, I'm not a doctor, and I'm not even really very interested in medicine. I come from basic science, like a lot of you do. I'm not interested in disease classifications. I'm interested in continuous variation, right? Might it be possible that metabolic factors are determining individual variation in a lot of parameters of thinking, right? In all of us all the time. Okay. It's also the case that bipolar people die of heart attacks more than anything else. They have a life expectancy 10 years lower than an average. Not because of suicide, but because of heart disease. Why are they prone to heart disease? Well, they never sleep, and sleep seems to be a part of it. But another suggestion is that maybe the core deficit, right, is actually in mitochondria. It's actually a metabolic issue. Diabetes, something like 52% of people with bipolar are on the spectrum of diabetes. And gout. Gout is it's really wild. People with this so-called mental illness, right? their mental illness can essentially give them gout, give them spikes in their joints, right? Why? Because adenosine, right, ATP molecule in ATP, adenosine basically is being cranked out at too high a rate because there's a hyper-metabolic thing going on. You have too much adenosine, it breaks down into purine. Purines are what the spikes are made of in gout, right? So you can end up with hyperuricemia, basically end up at risk for spikes in your joints because of your so-called mental illness, right? That's obviously not mental. Okay, and another point I want to make is that this is sort of along the lines of reframing how we think about neurodivergence. There's been some genetics work, like GWASs, right? Genome-wide association studies that look not just at categorical psychiatric labels like bipolar, schizophrenia, et cetera, right? But they also look at the big five personality factors, right? So this is basically a principal components analysis collapsed onto two dimensions, right? Where you can see that certain personality traits like extroversion, openness, tend to correlate with bipolar and ADHD to a certain extent. Bipolar people are generally not particularly conscientious. If you've ever, watched Kanye West, you know that, or particularly agreeable, but very extroverted, etc. So again, I'm leaning towards, gesturing towards at least a way that we might characterize that state space that I showed before in terms of genetics, right? Not genetics that predispose, not risk factors for disease, but variants that predispose people towards particular personality traits. Okay, two of my favorite parameters to think about are the speed of thought, right? And how sort of linear as opposed to associative or divergent is your thinking. Somehow, right, there must be physiological properties of neurons that are producing fast racing thoughts as opposed to the slow sluggish thoughts that people feel like when they're very depressed or just tired, right? And likewise this, right? You don't have to be bipolar to cycle between modes of like quick thought and thought where you feel creative, the flow state. Everybody knows this feeling, right? Where you're really like, you're finding it very easy to see connections between disparate things, right? And other states of mind where you can't see that at all, right? You're thinking in a very sort of narrower space. So, okay, so this I hand drew when we were in Scotland, and it's kind of crappy. I kind of shouldn't redo it, but it's just to illustrate these what I think of as these three different modes that all of us are sort of toggling between, right? You might think of an apple, then you think of apple pie, makes you think of the company Apple, how's your stock at Apple doing, and your laptop, right? When you're depressed, it's more like, oh, it's raining. Well, if I'm late again, my boss might fire me and my girlfriend's going to break up with me, or my girlfriend already did break up with me, right? In other words, there's a sense, and I have to credit Moshe Bar as a psychologist from Israel that I heard speak a long time ago. He talked about this idea that we might think of mental mood disorders as having more to do with like a movement through psychological space, like a state space, right? And what depression might have more to do with is being cramped into a small area of such a space, right? Rather than fundamentally mood. And here's an example of the kind of divergent cognition we all, have experienced before. Say I'm walking in Crete, the first time I've been to Greece, walking on the beach. And I remember it makes me think of this poem by Matthew Arnold. Listen, you hear the grating roar. Sophocles heard it long ago on the Aegean. I was thinking that because I heard the pebbles. I was walking with Rory, actually. I heard the pebbles being pulled back into the ocean by the wave, right? And I thought, oh, that's what he meant. I never realized that before, right? So that makes me think of talking about Plato and Aristotle with Rory back when we were in Scotland years ago, which makes me think of meeting Sophia Sanborn there in Crete. But in parallel, I might also be thinking of Nietzsche, right? Because Nietzsche has this notion of will and weight, the idea that your will or your drive ebbs and flows, right? Just like what I'm talking about today, right? And then that might make me think of Plato's chariot, right? The whole notion of Plato's chariot is that the reason drives the horses of desire, right? But, if there weren't horses, obviously the chariot wouldn't go anywhere, right? So I tend to flip that around, right? The horses, the desire is what's driving the thing. That makes me think of my favorite neuron. And then there, I don't know, that's the satyr. And Freud, represents the Dionysian. Freud stole a bunch of ideas from Egypt, so he's up there. So, okay. How am I doing on time? 5. Yikes. Okay. I'm gonna skip some stuff. All right. I'm gonna have to skip this one. I'm gonna have to skip this. I have to credit Alex. Alex gave me this wonderful program that would make AI play telephone with itself, right? Produce an image, then read the image out and produce another prompt and produce a bunch of images. I'll show you more of that later if I have time, if anybody wants to ask. That's just teaching you what you already know about how neurons work. This is kind of the important stuff about bipolar. So what emerged from those studies that I mentioned earlier, when you grow neurons in a dish from people with bipolar, this is the paper that really inspired me in 2015 in Nature. You see that the neurons are hyperexcitable, suggesting that their resting membrane potential is higher than normal, right? It takes less stimulation to make the neuron fire. And for some reason, lithium slows them down. We don't know how. You also see that the mitochondria are dysfunctional. They're like shrunken and slow. And again, that lithium mitigates it somehow. There's something like 1,000 genes upregulated. So it's an epigenetic phenomenon, rather than just, there are genetic mutations as well. Okay, a point I'm making with Robin Williams, there is a temperament characteristic of people who respond to lithium. It is my temperament. Okay, extreme talkativeness, short sleeping, tendency to repeat oneself. Sorry about that, right? Intolerance of boredom, expansiveness, tirelessness, irrepressibility, irresistible, and infectious quality. That's kind of nice. Overconfidence. I'm talking to a bunch of MIT, Harvard geniuses, and I'm going to teach 3rd grade tomorrow. Yeah, overconfidence, warmth, high energy level and productivity, over optimism, etc. So it's very interesting that you will meet people diagnosed with bipolar who don't respond to lithium, who present their phenotype is anxious or depressive as a standard personality. It's amazing to me that there would be a personality characteristic of a person who's going to respond to a particular drug. Even more amazing is that we found a protein, an ion channel, calcium channel, that seems to perhaps be a biomarker for lithium responsiveness, which means it might be a biomarker for that whole constellation of personality traits, right? I mean, that's a really wild thought. Okay, and how was this done? It was done with those same induced pluripotent stem cells, right? Grow a neuron, or a neuron that came from a bipolar person in the dish, and compare people with one variant of this particular subcomponent of an ion channel, calcium channel, to those with the other. And what they basically show is if lithium regularizes your circadian rhythm at the cellular level, you respond to lithium. And if it doesn't, then it doesn't, right? It's a fascinating discovery because intuitively it fits with what one knows to be true about bipolar, especially if one was hospitalized and claimed to right? for a manic episode, right? You know that you don't sleep normally, right? 4 hours last night, for example. And so it's amazing that what lithium is doing is somehow regularizing this cellular level circadian rhythm. And it's having an impact, I want to emphasize, not just on mood, but on cognition. Obviously on cognition, right? Okay, this I can't resist telling. So maybe this will be my last. Maybe this will be last. Close on. So these are the Huxleys. This is, of course, Aldous Huxley. He famously wrote a book called The Doors of Perception, which is what I like to call the ion channels, right? Because they're like literal gates, right? If there were any physiological doors of perception, they'd be ion channels. His brother, his half-brother, Andrew Huxley, Nobel laureate, he discovered the action potential, right? His grandfather, Thomas H. Huxley, Darwin's bulldog. He was also the first person to theorize that birds were descended from dinosaurs. But unfortunately, he's overshadowed by this Darwin's bulldog thing. Why? Because in this one day, 1860, the Bishop Wilberforce was giving a speech against Origin of Species, right? I used to think it was a formal debate. It wasn't a formal debate. Okay. It's like before there was a Kanye interrupting Taylor Swift, there was T.H. Huxley interrupting the bishop. So he shows up for the talk just to destroy him, right? And so Wilberforce is armed with all this kind of fake knowledge that he got from this other paleontologist. And this guy just tears into it, basically, explains why he's wrong. Before he went there, though, he wrote to Darwin and he said, or he spoke, I forget. He said to Darwin, I'm sharpening my beak at my talons in anticipation. So before I came to Boston, I was hoping I'd have to choose this sentence. I sharpened my beak and my talons in anticipation, right? But the people who are allergic to evolution today are not bishops. They're computer scientists, right? And I think if there is one message I wish people would take away from what I'm saying today, it's that we shouldn't be ignoring the actual physiological mechanisms behind cognition, especially with regard to hedonic drive, right? With regard to emotion, because I don't think it's the case. I think it's often treated like it's separate. You can just sort of study it later, but I don't think that's true. I think it's absolutely at the foundation of cognition. And I don't think it's just true for the mentally ill. Yeah.